Last time we saw how Jesus, in the Gospel of John, chapter 6, invited his disciples to share in him, to take his body and his blood. He said it was a necessity, an absolute necessity, that they eat his flesh and drink his blood. And today we are looking at what people call the institution of the Holy Communion, of the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. It was the last time that Jesus ate with his disciples before the Passion and the Crucifixion. And he timed that meal, that last meal, to happen during the Passover. And it's not an accident, it was not just like that it happened. That by doing so, Jesus put himself as the fulfillment of the Passover. We remember the story of the Passover and how the Israelites were taught how to sacrifice a lamb and put the lamb's blood on the lintel of the doors. And that sacrifice of the lamb prevented them from sickness and death. And the angel of death that killed the firstborn of the Egyptians on that night didn't touch any of the homes that had been covered by the blood of the lamb. So Jesus put himself as the lamb sacrifice for his people by instituting that meal that night, that evening. Second thing, we see that he did it as part of a meal. And that meant that it was within the sharing with others. So the communion is not an individual encounter. Well, it is in a way, but it's not only that. It's not an individual encounter between us individually and Jesus, but it's a church encounter as the body of Jesus. We are together sharing that meal. And it's in the global situation of a meal. And it indicates how sacred a meal is. In other cultures, for example in Igbo culture, if you eat a meal, you share a meal with someone, you cannot do anything bad about that person after. It's impossible. So people try to avoid eating if they plan evil, or they throw what they have taken. They cannot eat because once you eat, you enter an agreement of love with the person, and that's what Jesus did. So that was communion as part of a meal, and it was also a global thing within the disciples. And the only invitee on that meal were the disciples. No other. It was not like the teaching of Jesus that was for all and sundry. That one was restricted to the disciples. So it's telling us that that meal is a meal that should be shared only with those that belong to the Lord. It's not for outsiders. It's something where an exchange where Jesus gives and we give, and it's only for those of us that belong to him, those that have followed him, that are followers of Christ. We are disciples, and that meal is for us. But it doesn't mean that we should be completely pure and holy. We come to the meal just the way we are. And we remember that in the same situation, before the meal, Jesus removed his outer garment and started washing the feet of the disciples. And Peter was protesting, no, don't wash my feet. And Jesus said, unless I wash you, you have no part in me. And that the fact that he put this during the same meal tells us that that meal is a way of getting healing from the Lord. Physical healing, spiritual healing, being restored. As we take of that meal, we are getting restored in Him. So we can all come sick and dirty, but God is washing us as we partake of that meal. And then His words indicate that that communion with Him is also a covenant. As we take His blood by faith, as we take His body by faith, using bread and wine, that were the core items in Judaism meal, then we enter a covenant with Him, or we renew our covenant with Him, a covenant to follow Him, a covenant for Him to bless us, guide us, cleanse us, and all the rest. And we enter a covenant. We promise, yes, Lord, we want to continue in You. We want to be restored in You. We want to continue following You. And all the disciples that were there that day, except for Judas, continued in the Lord. And in fact, 11 out of 12 died, martyred for God. So they followed Him to the end. So it's a covenant. And then lastly, in Luke chapter 22 verse 19, Jesus tells them, each time you are going to do this, as often as you will do it in remembrance of Me. It means that anytime we gather together and share the body and blood by faith with thanksgiving, we are remembering the sacrifice of Jesus, His passion, His death, and also now His resurrection. And it's also a time we put ourselves in remembrance to God, and we are telling Him, Lord, we enter again into covenant with You. See us as we come. And that is all it means to have communion together. And Jesus never told people, do this every week, or do this every month, or do this every year. He didn't fix a time. He said, as often as you do it. And if we know the importance of communion with God, if we appreciate that He set this meal for us as a way of cleansing, healing, strengthening, energizing, and coming closer to Him, obviously we would like to do it more often than maybe what we are doing right now. But most importantly, we have to realize all that is in the communion meal. A coming together of the church, a covenant renewed, a remembrance service, an occasion of festive thanksgiving, and touching the sacred presence of the Lord in a special way. Bless you.